Hello, welcome again to Real Crusades History. I'm here with a friend of mine today, Rand, who is a researcher and a blogger, and he's actually does some really good stuff that you can check out on his blog. So, Rand, would you go ahead and tell us where we can see your materials?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called the Knight Errant Chronicles, and it's going to be www.castellanday at blogspot.com. I think there's an at in there somewhere. I can't remember.
Yeah, we can. I will definitely put the link on the screen.
Yeah, I'm sure if you can link it'll probably make the folks' lives a lot easier. But
yeah. Cool. So yeah, Rand, Rand and I have shared this interest of the Crusades for a long time, and I have really enjoyed Rand's research and his blog posts, so I definitely recommend it. So yeah, let's go ahead and kind of start talking about some of this. So our topic today is going to be the military history of the Crusades, or like the military aspect of the Crusades. And, I guess with your background too, Rand, having served in the military, that kind of does give you a pretty good perspective on that, right?
It does. One of the things I was told people was, even though I was just in for a 4-year stint in the Marine Corps, there's certain things about warfare. You look throughout all of military history, and you realize that there's going to be certain fundamental principles of human warfare that just will never change. There's certain things that are the same now as they were, 2,000 years ago. Warfare is just one of those intimately human phenomenon that I think, regardless of how you feel about it, either morally or ethically, it's always been there ever since the first man picked up the first stone to throw it his fellow man. It's wherever you're going, wherever you have humans, you're going to have warfare. It's just part of who we are. I guess you could almost say, maybe not the best part of who we are, but it's always going to be there, and there's going to be certain aspects of it that are going to stay the same as well, no matter where the technology goes, no matter where the tactics evolve or anything like that. And I would like to think that the guys that took up the cross in 1095 and afterwards to go off on the great adventure to the Levant. There's something really stirring about that. Again, kind of regardless of how you feel about it. And I know as you very well know, I'm sure that the Crusades are not a popular topic in our modern times. Sadly,
I think they're starting to become more popular with a growing segment of the population.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, and I think hopefully societies change and societal perceptions change, and I'm sure. Well, I know for a fact that your effort is a plays a big part in that. But
yeah, I think they're controversial. I mean, for sure. It's really amazing how the Crusades bring out these big online, flame wars even today, 1,000 years later. So.
Well, and I think sadly it goes to show just how pervasive, politically motivated history can be on a societal wide basis, and it kind of goes back to Goebbels' famous quote that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes eventually it becomes the truth. And I think the Crusades have been lied about so just continually in the modern era that sadly there is this perception of the Crusaders as these ignorant, racist, intolerant, rapacious fanatics who just wanted to go demolish this supposedly beautiful Islamic civilization that existed out there.
Yeah, I definitely heard it all. I mean, it's
completely ignoring the fact that the Crusades are motivated by they were a defensive response to almost 4 centuries of nonstop Islamic aggression. against the Christian world. So, but anyway, so yeah, it's that was kind of a long tangent there, but
yeah, but important stuff nonetheless.
Absolutely.
So let's go get into some of this topic. So Rand, what was Western warfare like in the crusading period, and how did it differ from what we've been told by modern history?
Well, the first thing I always tell people when discussing what just medieval warfare in general was like, and even then, you have to realize that the medieval period was not a homogeneous time period. There's a lot of different time periods even within the medieval period, but one of the biggest things I always tell people is anything you've seen in Hollywood or from film, forget it. They get it wrong every single time, and I think people have this idea of medieval warfare as these grand sweeping epic battles that lasted for hours and were horrifically cruel and violent and bloody and body parts flying everywhere and all this kind of thing. Kind of the Braveheart idea, image, really, medieval warfare, if you could describe it as anything, it was extremely limited compared to the warfare that we know today in the modern era. In the Middle Ages, all aspects of warfare were so much more intimately small scale. I think it's kind of hard for a lot of people to kind of conceive of it. The Battle of Agincourt, which was fought in 1415, that was immortalized in Shakespeare's Henry V, was fought on a field that was literally about 400 yards square. It was a couple of football fields, essentially is what we're talking about. And that battle was considered that was sort of a generational battle. That was a battle like Hastings or Hastings in 1066 and Legnano in northern Italy, and some of the battles that like everybody would have been talking about back in that day. And it happened on such a tiny piece of land. To give people perspective, if you fly, as the crow flies, if you go about 130 miles south of where the Battle of Agincourt was fought, you're gonna run into the essentially the valley where in 1915 the Battle of the Somme took place during the Great War, and that took place on a several hundred square mile area of land, and over 1 million men, both Allied and Central powers, died there. But it's just that's war in the modern era. In the modern era, we've been introduced to the concepts of total war, unrestricted war, three-dimensional war. So it's very hard to realize that on the medieval battlefield, the only area of destruction really that you could find was how far you could shoot a bow or a crossbow, or how far your sword arm could reach. So it was much more intimate. It was much more much closer in, much smaller, and much more limited. Another thing, a lot of people, especially when you're talking about the Crusades militarily, another thing people try to bring out is how cruel medieval warfare was. How the image of villages being burnt down and the peasants being slaughtered wholesale, or the collateral, the civilian collateral damage, because apparently the aristocratic mounted knights couldn't care less about the common people and whatnot. And again, that's a horrible misrepresentation of medieval warfare. Did things like pillage occur? Yes, but actually, even the word pillage, and this would have even applied to the time of the First Crusade. The term pillage really just meant pre-modern logistics. It was you didn't have nation states with central governments that had a monopoly on the means of making war, and thereby, civilian supply apparatus to bring, war-making supplies to the front. In the Middle Ages, there was no such centralized concepts. Those didn't exist. So when an army, went into a different land, it was commonly understood that they were going to live off that land, and that's essentially what pillage was. And pillage didn't even mean that you take, that you go and you burn the villages and burn the fields and things like that. There were actually very strict rules governing pillage and how it was supposed to happen, and for very good reason. You didn't want to, especially if you were hoping to, if you were a medieval military leader, which meant you would have been a member of either the royalty or the aristocracy, and you were hoping to keep the land that you were campaigning in. Why would you strip it?
Yeah, why would you destroy everything?
Yeah, why would you destroy everything? And royally, hack off the people that you're, hopefully going to be ruling over someday. In the midst of conquering it, it doesn't make any sense. And when you look into the sources, the only times that they actually did have, burning the crops and destroying the villages and things like that. Those were very specific instances, and it was more a tactical consideration, usually by an army that had no intention of staying in the land that they were going to, or to economically weaken a much stronger opponent. You see that a lot with during the 100 Years' War. With the chevauchés, or the mounted raids that the English armies would undertake deep into French territory, and they would basically think of it as like a raid in depth, to sort of smash and wreck anything that you can get your hands on and then get out, to financially and psychologically weaken, your opponent. And a lot of times men who did that were not very popular. Military commanders in the medieval period who engaged in such actions were usually very highly frowned upon, especially by the church, which had kind of served a role of, I think, what a lot of people today would maybe equate as like the United Nations. Sort of a larger body, international body that would attempt to govern, sort of an international code of law, if you will. Only, with the church, it was more focused on morality and human rights, or at least far more so than the United Nations of today. But so again, with military war, or with medieval warfare, you're thinking very small scale, very limited, and even pitched battles were very rare events. Pitched battles were only engaged in when there was no other choice, which is why they stand out so much in the medieval chronicles. Most medieval campaigning would have consisted 80% of just sort of raiding, counter-raiding, seizing fortresses or strongholds, or engaging in tactical retreats or counterattacks or things like that. So a lot more maneuvering would have gone on, especially since in the early Middle Ages, which early to high, which is right about where the Crusading period would fit in. Your set piece on the battlefield was the mounted knightly aristocrat. The knights on horseback were they were sort of they were the warrior class. That was their job. That was their whole purpose for existing. Was to wage war. Was to have a monopoly on warfare. it's a lot of misconceptions like that I think too many people, when they look at medieval warfare, first off, they're way too influenced by what they see in popular culture, and two, it's hard to envision a world in which the most intense military conflicts took places on fields that were not much bigger than a football field today. So I think it's hard for people to get into that mindset, but really, in a way, it's a fantastic subject, because it shows, again, taking that war has always been with us in humanity, in the history of humankind, but then you scale it back. What was it like before there was all this technology, before there was all this distance, before you could just flick a switch and kill 200 people from 1,000 miles away? What was it like when in the days when for the most part you were face to face with the man that you killed, every time. You watched him die, and stuff like that, and that's just the way all the wars were done. So, and again, I think it makes it it impresses the point of just how limited it was, especially taking into consideration how face to face it all was. We naturally don't. Humans don't have a natural instinct to kill one another. In fact, if naturally we have anything, we have a revulsion against that. And so I think that's where a lot of things like the code of chivalry and the fact that especially amongst the aristocratic, the noble classes, they were much more intent on capturing opponents than they were killing them. Granted, there was also a pretty significant financial reward attached to that as well. But perfect example was, and this was actually just after the First Crusade ended and was successful. There was a battle fought in Normandy between the forces of King Henry I of England and King Louis the Fat of France. Both armies were entirely mounted knights. There were no footmen that took part, and it was about I think one had about 500 on his side, and the other had 800. And in the entire battle, it was a huge battle. A lot of the chroniclers talk about it, or Derek Vitalis has an entire chapter devoted to it. It was considered a huge battle because it was two kings, two royal forces clashing, and yet in the entire battle, 3 knights died.
Right. Yeah.
That was it. So yeah, I hopefully I covered most of it. But the biggest takeaways are how limited it was, how decentralized it was, because you didn't have the concept of the modern nation state, and how really how very class conscious and how small scale all that warfare was.
Yeah. So, okay, what about the Crusades made them unique from a military perspective?
The Crusades, I mean, since having been somewhat of an amateur medievalist, you cannot talk about the Middle Ages without talking about the Crusades. They just sort of dominate, the entire topic, because it was a very, even just from a cultural, from a much wider cultural and social aspect, they were incredibly unique. There really has not been another phenomenon like it, really, in history. There's been some things that came close, but really just the idea of people spontaneously going, packing themselves up and going off into what at that time would have been a completely different planet to them, on the far side of the world, to go fight a people they knew very little about, for the sake of faith, for the sake of moral and spiritual principles. I mean, the accusations of the Crusades were about imperialism or colonizing Muslim lands is just it's laughable, really. To hear people try to say that, because those concepts didn't even exist in the medieval mind, and at that time, and so they're just a very unique phenomenon to begin with. But I think one aspect that always gets overlooked is the military aspect of them. These were military undertakings, essentially, and you see some very, very unique attributes, I guess, or principles in them, in that separate them from all the rest of the wars that were ever fought in the Middle Ages. I'd say probably the first one is going to be your clash of cultures. It was the Crusades although there had been clashes between East and West prior to that, with the Spanish, the fighting of the Islamic invasion on the Iberian Peninsula, and the Muslim army that made it all the way up into Tours in the 730s and was stopped by Charles Martel. But really, there hadn't been such a large-scale confrontation between the Eastern way of war versus the Western way of war until the Crusades. And you really, really see it come out in the First Crusade, because that was kind of, it was the first time on a large scale that a Western force had engaged on Muslim territory like they did. So, and not to say that, the Eastern way of war and the Western way of war are these monolithic principles, like I think some people try to make it out to be. Like, I'm not sure if you've read anything by like Victor Davis Hanson, but there very much was a clash of military cultures, especially between, the Western emphasis on pitched battles and charging in, to a force, and the Eastern, the predominantly Eastern strategy or strategic culture of standoff, and putting distance between you and the opposing force, and either shooting stuff or throwing stuff at him, sort of, the skirmisher, horse archer, cultures that you find amongst the Turks and and the other steppe peoples that, that form the majority of of the opponents of the Western Crusaders. And you see this clash, I think in a lot of ways, I think too often people try to make it out like, this clash between tactical cultures was a negative thing for the Western Crusaders. But really, if you look at it, there's several times where that very much worked in their favor. I mean, in the First Crusade, the Turks were very much thrown off by the way the Franks fought. It baffled them. They weren't used to somebody who charged at them like that. The famous charge at Kerboga, while the Crusaders were at Antioch, to break Kerboga's siege, it's a along with being probably one of the most exciting parts of the First Crusade, it's a demonstration of just how unprepared Islamic forces were for the Western style of warfare. And Kerboga, who was before Antioch, was probably one of the most highly respected Islamic military leaders of his time, basically watched his career get trampled underfoot that day, with the Crusaders. And even the Western emphasis on heavy armor and heavier weaponry, because they were used to that melee. They were used to getting in close, So from even just a purely material sense, in that the Western armor and weaponry was so vastly superior to anything their Islamic opponents had at the time. The Turks calling the men of the First Crusade the men of steel, because their arrows were almost useless against the mailed knights, So it's just a fascinating study to look into just how much of a military clash of cultures went on in the Crusades. I'd say another very unique aspect of the Crusades from a military standpoint was the again, sort of going back to what I opened up with, and that is just the very unconventional objectives of the Crusades. These were not war. This is not a war to conquer territories and to colonize and to create empires. This was a war literally to liberate a holy city for all of Christendom, and that was it, and to just hold it. And you see, I love the people that try to object and say, oh, well, they absolutely were about conquering territory and subjugating people and spreading the faith by the sword, which is just another ridiculous accusation. But another one, a comeback I always have to that is no, they when the Kingdom of Jerusalem was founded, and I know you know this, they actually had laws that promoted the free practice of other faiths other than Christianity within the kingdom. In fact, the Muslim and Jewish citizens of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were not even required to pay the church tithe like Christians were, because that it didn't apply to them. And the Frankish rulers in the Holy Land were actually probably some of the most progressive people of the time. And were hailed so by even Islamic writers of the day. So and they brought, yeah, exactly, and praising how they have, they brought such a rule of law with them. The Western tradition of the rule of law, and how you didn't have the kind of tribalistic infighting like you had amongst the various Muslim warlords at the time, that once they held that land, they brought an element of order, an element of tolerance, and really they just wanted the city to be free and open for Christian for Christian pilgrims to come and pay homage to the center of the world as they saw it. So it again, just very unconventional to think that men and materials, would be mustered and called up for such a cause. And it's that aspect of it that really, and I know it's probably a very controversial thing to say, but in my opinion, I think that was sort of one of the moral golden ages of the West. That here you didn't have a land being fought for, you didn't have a war being fought for greed or for power or for subjugation or anything like that. That it was more a war of liberation and really chivalry. And I think that it's those aspects that the people who don't just automatically have a negative attitude towards the Crusades, I think it's that aspect that attracts so many people.
Yeah. So, okay, Rand, so how did Western military strategy and tactics evolve during the Crusades period?
It's a really fascinating thing to delve into and study. But some of the innovations, for lack of a better word, that came about during that period, really did. You see these, you see them impact even on wars then later fought back home in Europe. One of them would be the unity of command and the cohesiveness that existed amongst the Crusaders and then later amongst the Crusader states. You did not have, back in Europe, you had, because everything was so decentralized, because society was so decentralized, especially from a political standpoint. And you had, even within a realm, even though you had a king at the top, you had hundreds, sometimes even thousands of nobles and aristocrats and minor knights below him who, a lot of times, even though they were technically, belonging to the same kingdom, they were constantly fighting with each other, and they were, sometimes they would even form their own little coalitions and go after the king, and who knows. But in the Holy Land, I think very quickly the men that went out on the First Crusade realized that they were it. This was all there was. That each other was all they had, and it's in the Crusades that you see these almost international coalitions form.
Oh yeah.
And even nations that back in Europe would have been at each other's throats, but once they got out into the Holy Land, that was it. They each other was all they had. And you see that in the Third Crusade, with King Richard, and you see that with the First Crusade, with all the different barons, all the different nobles that led that, and just the cohesiveness and the unity of command. I think that was another aspect, that even though they were just unbelievably outnumbered, compared to the various Islamic states that surrounded them. I think that's why the Crusaders were able to hold their own for as long as they could, because they had that sense of cohesion with each other. Even another great example to use is just before the Third Crusade, after the disaster at Hattin, Guy of Lusignan, regardless of however you feel about him, the probably the most hapless of kings of Jerusalem that there ever was. When he was released from captivity, and called the remaining, what remaining Crusader nobles were left to send men and materials so that he could try to take back Acre, they did so without question. And this was a guy who, they didn't. He was not popular amongst them. I know this, but he was a very unpopular king. Most of the Crusader nobles at the top of the kingdom at the time did not care for him at all. And yet when he came back and made the decision to go take back Acre, they still came to him the same as if he had been, Baldwin IV. It's just, there was an attitude of, we are all we have out here, and we're going to make this work, even if we don't necessarily like each other. We're going to do this, and that's something that you do not see very much of on the Muslim side. Usually the greatest amount of cohesion and unity that the Muslim powers were ever able to muster was when one basically just went out and conquered them all. Yeah. So, and Salah ad-Din, probably one of the most overrated characters of the Crusades. While, yes, very politically skillful, and how he was able to craft a Syrio-Egyptian coalition, it fell apart the day he died. And even when he was alive, he had more struggles. He had more intense struggles trying to maintain that coalition than he ever did against the Western Crusaders. So it just that I think it was a very unique display of what Western armies are capable of doing when they have that sort of cohesion with each other, and unity of command. Another one, another very sort of unique tactic that would eventually spread to all of Europe during the Crusades was the fortress building, the network of fortresses and castles that they built, that the Crusaders built throughout the Holy Land. The First Crusade, massive walled cities were something that was very rare in Western Europe at the time of the First Crusade, and you got to imagine these guys coming from small communities in Western Europe, and encountering massive ancient cities like Constantinople and Nicaea and Antioch, places like that, and the massive walled fortifications that they must have had, and they were very influenced by that. And some of the Crusader castles that were built, I mean, those were the real linchpins of who owned the Levant. Those castles were everything. And if you read the accounts of the Crusades, it's probably the greatest priority any military commander had out there was who owned those castles. And even their architecture, reflected how important these were. I mean, you see pictures of Crac de Chevalier, look at them while you can, sadly, if the Syrians don't wipe it out. But it's probably one of the most impressive fortresses of any period, and it's just, and that was just one. It goes to show just how massive and powerful these fortresses were, and that's something you start to see after the Crusades when men, when warriors would come to the Holy Land to fulfill a crusading vow, they took a lot of those ideas back with them. Probably one of the most notable was Edward I of England, who went out to the Holy Land with the Ninth Crusade and came back to England. When he continued his wars as King of England in Wales to subjugate the Welsh people, he subjugated that nation by building castles. It was Edward's castle building strategy was what finally secured the wild Welsh for the English crown. And you see the influence of the Crusader castles and a lot of his castles there. You look at pictures of Harlech, Carnarvon, Ruthlon. All those castles. You can see the massive thick walls with the concentric towers that you see in the castles in the Holy Land. So those castles. The idea of the medieval castle and the strategy that surrounds it, that really came from the Crusades. Because before then, you really didn't have that. Before then, castles were, for the most part, wooden. You had sort of it was like the Motte and Bailey type, design, and maybe with a stone keep in the center, but that was about it. The giant stone castles that everybody associates with the medieval period, that came from the Crusades. I'm trying to keep this as short as possible. I know I'm kind of dragging on, but another very unique development that would come out of the Crusades would be the military orders, the religious military orders, especially the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. John. These were so incredibly unique that even during the Middle Ages themselves, many Western medievals had what's the word I'm looking for? Hesitant feelings about the idea of the warrior monk, and the monk who would take the vows of a religious, but whose occupation was as a knight, as a warrior, and the epic engagements that would take place during the history of the Crusades with the military orders really is it's really something else to read. But I think what made them so unique was that these were men who didn't answer to the feudal concept of obligations to a lord like secular knights did. These men were extremely tight, elite military units who, in a lot of ways, and I've even read modern military authors who've made this analogy that they were almost sort of a proto modern military force. They, because of the level of discipline, they weren't fighting to enhance their own reputation or to enrich themselves. Their sole purpose was to serve as a crack force of military power for the Western Crusaders. That would be their only job, and in the exactly, and in the medieval sense, that's about as close to a professional force as you can get until you start getting into the later Middle Ages, after the sort of the infantry revolution, as it were. So very, very unique, and it goes without saying their emphasis on fighting as a profession garnered them a pretty ferocious reputation, even amongst their enemies. I mean, they you read Islamic chroniclers, and they have nothing but either fear, begrudging respect, or just outright hatred for the Knights Templar and for the Knights Hospitaller. I mean, it was these were guys who, I mean, because of you had the religious element, the sort of the religious devotion element. These guys would fight to the death a lot of times. I mean, if they found themselves in a spot where they weren't going to make it out or they were going to lose, they usually went down to the last man. And you've got phenomenal stories like the charge of the 500 Templars at Montgazard, and things like that, just rolling up an entire army, So, I think, Salah ad-Din, after barely escaping within an inch of his life on a racing camel, it's no wonder then about a decade later, any Templars and Hospitallers at Hattin, he gave the order of no quarter to. I don't think that was out of so much cruelty as it was out of. I don't think he ever wanted to be facing them again.
Yeah, but he would be.
Yeah. So, and I guess if I had to pick one last thing out, one last very unique element of strategy and tactics from the Crusades, it would be it's really the first time in Western warfare, or at least Western warfare after the ancient period, where you see the concepts of maritime power and force projection from the sea take such a center stage, like they did with the Crusades. The Crusades would not have succeeded if they had not, from the very beginning, begun the practice of maintaining naval dominance there in the Eastern Mediterranean and keeping open those maritime supply routes from Western Europe into the Levant. I mean, you cannot. There is not a single chronicle of the Crusades out there that does not mention how important being able to bring in supplies and reinforcements by means of the sea, into those port cities like Accra and Ascalon and places, and Jaffa and places like that. It was just such an important element to the Crusaders' success and their survival, really. One of my favorites to bring up is how naval support was utilized during King Richard's crusade. Richard, apart from just being, I think, one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval period as a whole, he was very much ahead of his time tactically. His concept of using maritime power as his what we call the maneuver element, basically using that seaborne support to quickly move forces up and down the Palestinian coast, was extremely unique in his day and age. You don't see anything like that taking place in Europe, and really you don't see it ever again until you start, you get into the modern period. And it really was just, I mean, his sailing, landing at Jaffa, to break the siege there at Jaffa, jumping off the ship, and wading ashore, sort of the almost kind of conjures as like a medieval equivalent of like the Normandy landings, I mean, it yeah, exactly. That just, that concept, and it was also so foreign to the Muslims. I think that was something that they could never quite grasp. They could never quite grasp that the reason the Crusaders were able to survive as long as they did was because they brought in this element of maritime superiority, and the idea of projecting power from the sea, projecting military power from the sea. Like I said, you will not, other than the Crusades, you're never going to see that again until modern warfare.
Yeah. Okay, so what militarily contributed to the Crusaders' initial success?
Initially, probably one of the best things they had going for them was that clash of military cultures. The Westerners just had they had a superior fighting style, that charging in and getting in close, that the Islamic powers couldn't stand up to that. Islamic armies couldn't match that. They didn't have as good of weapons. They didn't have as good of armor. Their whole fighting style was to be very light, very fast, and to just sort of chuck things at people from a distance. This idea of the heavily armored knight charging in close with his lance, that they couldn't stand that. They couldn't stand up to that. And you see that over and over again, especially in the First Crusade. You see it at Dorylaeum. You see it at Antioch. You see it at even when they after they had taken Jerusalem, and Godfrey fights with the Fathmids down at Ascalon. I mean, it's just they continually just can't stand up to that tactic of charging in and getting close versus skirmishing from a distance. Related to that is just the Franks just had better quality armor and weapons. The idea of Islamic culture being so much more scientifically advanced and technologically advanced really falls flat when you look at the quality of armor and weapons that you had in Europe, even at the time of the First Crusade, even in the early medieval period. Because they had that emphasis on charging in and getting close, with thick hand-to-hand melee, you're going to have phenomenal advancements in metallurgy, in armor, production and weapon production. And so they were, again, the Turks referred to the men of the First Crusade as the men of steel for a reason. They just couldn't match the quality of their armor, and their weapons for the most part were somewhat ineffective against them. Another aspect that contributed to their success, and you especially see this in the First Crusade, is what I like to call the Cortez effect. And yes, I made that up. I didn't steal that from anybody. But
I like that term, though.
Yeah, it's the Cortez effect is, essentially, I mean, it refers to, Hernan Cortez when he landed in Veracruz, with 500 men against an entire Aztec empire. Is that there are these moments in Western military history where, and it really is something that's very unique to the West for the most part. You look around at other cultures and you really don't see this being displayed, but there's something about Western forces that end up in a strange and hostile environment, and suddenly they become such a stronger, tighter, more cohesive unit than they ever would have been otherwise. And they're able to pull off these miracle survivals against all odds, you know. You know, you even see that in the pre-Christian West, you know. I mean, you see that with the, you know, during the Greco-Persian Wars, and you see that with, you know, Xenophon and his you know, March of the 10,000 out of the Persian Empire, and you know, then Alexander, you know, and leading a Greek army, you know, all the way to the Indies, you know, and basically smashing apart everything that stood in his way. Even though, you know, a lot of times in some of those battles he was outnumbered 3-1, you know. So it's just there's just so many examples of that, and the First Crusade especially was very much an example of that. It was, I mean, these guys, they were it. That they were all they had, and they knew that nobody else was going to come for them. Nobody was going to rescue them. There was no retreat. You know, they had essentially, like Cortez, they had essentially burned their ships. You know, this was it. And they were either going to survive and make it to Jerusalem, or they were going to die trying. And you know, they did. So
yeah, Christopher Tyerman in God's War, he actually mentioned that there was just this obvious, you know, spirit of the body among the First Crusaders while they were in this foreign territory.
Exactly.
And like you said, that came out of groups of men who were from all these different parts of Europe, you know. And these initial armies, like these separate armies, like the Norman armies from South Italy and the provincial armies from southern France, the northern French armies, over time, as, you know, men died and, you know, some leaders left, like Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois, these different groups were like melded together.
Exactly.
It's really interesting.
In the you know, in the furnace of combat, essentially. You know, and lastly, you know, while this, you know, wasn't so much a factor, you know, near the end of the Crusades, but, you know, one of the things that definitely did help the Crusades initially was the total lack of any kind of coordination or unity amongst their Islamic opponents. You know, people tend to not realize that Islamic civilization of the 11th century was probably the most fractured, divided, you know, incohesive civilization out there. I mean, it was nothing but a bunch of very, you know, small petty warlords and emirs who, I mean, they were constantly fighting with each other. You know, the death of the last caliph had just happened, you know, I believe it was about 2 centuries prior to that. You know, so you have you know, you already have the split in Islam religiously between Sunni and Shiite. You know, so I mean, there was just a lot of disunity going on amongst the Muslims, and they kind of always had that going on with each other. And it was it's a very you know, it's a very tribal society. You know, you see that. Ironically, you even see that in Islamic societies and cultures to this day. You know, for supposedly all professing the same faith, they're remarkably divided amongst each other, and I think there's sort of a tribal instinct that just exists in that part of the world. You know, it's your tribal loyalty comes first, and then everything else comes second. You know. And that was very much a factor of the Crusaders' initial success.
Yeah. Okay, so why would you say that the Crusades to the Holy Land ultimately failed?
Yeah, you know, I guess we get to the sad part of the conversation. It's or the, you know, the tragic part, the heroic but tragic, you know, part is that from a military standpoint, ultimately the Crusades were sort of doomed to fail. And and first and foremost, it was a numbers game. They just the amount of men who could go out to the Holy Land and actually contribute to, maintaining its independence and security. It just was there just weren't enough of them. Especially when you're trying to scrape out a state essentially that is completely surrounded by hostile powers, and your back is to the sea. The Israelis would learn that lesson also the hard way a couple of times. In the modern period, but it's a very difficult. Even just geographically, the Levant is a very difficult part of the planet to try and militarily defend. You have to be extraordinarily aggressive. You have to be very well supplied, and you have to have a lot of numbers behind you in order to successfully do that. And sadly, the Crusaders, and part of sort of because of the way the crusading phenomenon occurred, they just were never going to have those numbers. Men would come from Europe on a crusading vow, and then for the most part, once they would reach Jerusalem, they were done, and they went back home. Very, very few. I think even after the First Crusade ended, I think it was only like, I think it was about 1,000 knights, or even less than that, actually stayed, So, yeah. So, I mean, honestly, the incredible part about the Crusades about the Crusader kingdoms is that they existed as long as they did. And I think that, again, that just goes to, that's just a testament to the cohesiveness and the dedication of the Frankish forces. And also, as the crusading period went on, sadly, you also saw in Europe a gradual, it was very gradual, but a steady decline of the crusading zeal. The Crusades were they were a groundswell event. They were very much from the ground up, grassroots, if you will. It was the people who initially, spurred that movement, and not kings and popes and emperors and things like that. For the most part, it was the common people. It was the zeal of the common people that inspired the leaders to take part. So, but once you start seeing things like the loss of Jerusalem, the defeat at Hattin, the failure to retake Jerusalem, and then the tragic events of the Fourth Crusade, and the destruction of Constantinople, from the capture of it from a Christian people, I think you eventually just start to see that zeal wane off, and you just don't have as many people who are really interested, for lack of a better term, interested in going off to the Holy Land, to go, fight on the other side of the world. Too many problems at home. You have the gradual escalation of conflicts back in Europe. Wars in Europe as the Middle Ages progressed began getting bigger. So that by the time the 14th century rolls around, I mean, you have, in 1337, you have the start of the 100 Years' War, and it lasts for 117 years. Probably the closest thing to a world war that you'd ever get in the Middle Ages. So I think it was just eventually the Crusades, while there was still very much sort of a chivalric attraction to them, they had sort of an aura, about them. From a practical standpoint, they just nobody is really interested in seriously doing any of that. And even from a religious standpoint, I think there were things that contributed to the zeal waning off. I mean, you have you start to have popes who, they just kind of start proclaiming crusades against anybody they don't like, and whether they're Christian or not.
Yeah, Frederick II comes to mind, of course.
Yeah, and the Albigensian Crusades in southern France, and the Northern Crusades with the Teutonic Knights up in central and northern Europe. While initially they were against a pagan people, they were against the pagan Lithuanians, but by the late 13th century, the Lithuanians embraced Christianity, and yet the Teutonic Order is still fighting them, and it's just, and then in the 14th century they go off and pick fights with very Catholic Poland. It just doesn't make any. Yeah, it just doesn't make any. The idea. I think sort of the abuse of the crusading phenomenon. I think very much contributed to the gradual decline of there just being any zeal for that at all in Western Europe. So, and once that happened, once you lost the zeal, you lost the numbers, and then it was just a matter of time before the Muslims became strong enough to just roll over it all. Related to those, you had issues with logistics and supplies. Once if there's very little zeal, and if there's no real reinforcements coming in anymore, there's not a whole lot of supplies coming in either. And so it's just gradually they just kind of lost. They lost the initiative, and they lost their momentum. So while there were some noble efforts near the end, I honestly, one of my absolute favorite stories from the crusading period is, the last stand at Acre in 1297. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospital are fighting side by side, to the last man, and then the 30 Knights Templar who hold up in the Citadel Tower, and when Baybars sent emissaries to go demand their surrender, they sent back their heads, and when Baybars orders, when he ordered the last assault, the Knights Templar had undermined the foundations of the Citadel, and they brought down the entire tower, on themselves, but also the Egyptians coming in, and it's just a stirring story.
That is a great story. I love
that. It's like the Alamo or Thermopylae. Just that last stand, and there were a couple of those. And even some of the last couple of Crusades. Poor St. Louis the Ninth. You got to at least admire him for not wanting to give up.
It is amazing that after the 7th Crusade, he was willing to try another one.
Oh, I know, and the brilliant show made by at the time he was still Prince of Wales, but he wouldn't have been Prince of Wales, but he was still the heir to the English throne. But Edward I, being out there on the 9th Crusade, he did a phenomenal job as a military leader. It's just, again, we're talking about it was a numbers game, and they just did not have the Western forces just did not have the momentum anymore to be able to win. So, ultimately it was going to fail.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Okay. So how about just kind of some last thoughts here, Rand? What are some shining examples of military genius during this period for you?
Oh gosh, I'd have to say, one of the first and foremost, no pun intended, but would be the overall combined leadership of the First Crusade. With Godfrey, Bowman, Raymond, Robert Curthose. I mean, you had Godfrey's brother Baldwin, who went off and seized the county of Edessa. I mean, you had some incredible experience amongst all of them, and they had their own issues with each other. I know there was no love lost between Raymond and Bowman.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
but you know, but at the same time, I mean, you know, these weren't, you know, these were guys who, I mean, they've been fighting wars their entire lives, and some of them, like Bowman, honestly, if I had to pick out one amongst all of them, just in terms of military ability and leadership, Bowman was, I mean, he was phenomenal. He was monolithic amongst them. And part of what made him so valuable, part of what made his experience so valuable to the cause as a whole, was that unlike really any of the others, he had experience fighting in that part of the world. You know, him and his father, you know, in their campaigns against the Greek emperors, you know, in Constantinople. I mean, they fought Turkish mercenaries. They knew how they, you know, they knew what they were. Bowman knew what he was going to face out there, and I think, you know, especially at the engagement at Doralam, it was his leadership that really kept that movement alive in its infancy. You know, because he knew what to do, unlike the other ones, and I think the other ones learned very quickly from him, to the point where, you know, Baldwin's mini campaign to go seize the county of Edessa. I mean, that was brilliant. I mean, that really was. I mean, that's maneuver warfare on a grand scale at its finest. You know, and then even Godfrey. You know, I mean, Godfrey being able to consolidate what had been won. You know, so that they didn't lose it immediately. And securing the southern flank there at Ascalon. You know, I mean, these guys knew what they were doing, and I think that's what made the First Crusade so successful. Another favorite example of mine, and I know I've talked ad nauseum about him. I'm in the midst of a blog series about him and about his experiences in Palestine, but would be King Richard I, the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. I mean, he, probably more so than any single one Crusader commander, was just brilliant in his overall strategy, in his tactical execution, in his leadership capability. I mean, he ran circles around the vaunted Salah-ad-Din for over a year with far fewer men and far less resources. You know, and it was because he was able to utilize, you know, every aspect of his forces, you know, to include that maritime power, that naval superiority, you know, to just constantly be projecting power, you know, all up and down the Palestinian coast. So much so that really, I mean, by the end of his campaign, even though sadly Jerusalem was never able to be reached, basically almost all of Salah-ad-Din's gains that he had gotten prior to that, you know, in the Hattin campaign, he basically lost all that by the time Richard was done with him. And, and Richard just he inflicted defeat after defeat after defeat on him, almost so much so that even before his death, I think Salah-ad-Din was very concerned about the fact that he had pretty much lost his reputation amongst his own people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and he just could never pin Richard down. He could never block him. He could never anticipate his next move. And I mean, he really did. Richard ran circles around him the entire time he was there. And the fact that, you know, the only thing for the most part Richard's ever remembered for is that, oh, he failed to get Jerusalem back. It's like, I feel like it's incredibly unfair to his memory. You know, I mean, he was just a brilliant commander, and the Third Crusade, from a strategic standpoint, was very much a success for the Crusaders, and it allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to survive for another 100 or so years. So, I guess if I had to pick one other, you know, great example, it would be, and I've already mentioned him, but would be, you know, Prince Edward's brief campaigns in the Ninth Crusade. You know, and again, I think he very much had the potential to be another Richard. You know, had he had more time and greater forces available to him. I mean, the fact that his actions we're able to bring somebody like Baybars to the negotiating table. That's an accomplishment in and of itself. I mean, this was a guy, Baybars. We're talking about Baybars. We're talking about a guy who, I mean, he was able to militarily defeat the Mongols. He probably a much greater military commander than Saladin ever was. And yet, Prince Edward, with just a handful of, Crusaders from Europe, was able to force him to the table at one point. So,
Yeah, the Ninth Crusade has always seemed to me like, I mean, it should be chalked up as a success, if anything. I mean, it wasn't a defeat by any stretch of the imagination.
And nothing, for no other reason other than it was a phenomenal example of sort of a sword at sunset. It was the Crusades weren't gonna go out with a whimper.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
So, Rand, I really appreciate having you on to talk about this. Obviously, this is a subject that you and I both have a lot of enthusiasm for, so I'm glad we got to have you on.
Absolutely, I was very privileged to be able to be here and to do this with you, and I hope I didn't prattle on for too long for you. But
no, not at all.
It's always a good sign when you get so into talking to something, and then like you look at the clock and you're like, oh my gosh, I've been talking about this for hours.
Yeah, that's exactly how I am with the Crusades. But so yeah, Rand again has a really good blog that I hope. I mean, I do post your stuff on the Real Crusades History Facebook page all the time. So yeah, everybody, do please check out Rand's blog. And Rand, why don't you just give the address one more time? But I will put it in the.
Absolutely, it's www.castellumdei. It's Latin for Citadel of God at blogspot.com. And if you need the spelling of it, the link will be there. I'm sort of flattered that you place such value on it. I feel the need to apologize. Sadly, since I started grad school, I haven't really been able to do much with it lately. But hopefully over the Christmas break, I'm hoping to finish up my series on Richard in Palestine, and I've got a lot of other pieces that I wrote in the past, not just about the Crusades, but there's a lot in there about just sort of medieval military history in general, topics that have interested me, and I very much hope as soon as I can feel like I can come up for a breath with grad school, I'll hopefully be continuing with it. So, but again, I just thank you for the attention that you've given it and the coverage that you've attracted to it. That's more so than I could have ever done for myself. So,
absolutely,
thank you very much.
No problem, man. So yeah, your Third Crusade blog has been really good. So I do hope everybody will check that out. So
absolutely. Well, I'm hoping to get the next series in there probably sometime by the end of either this week or next week. So, but other than that, and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and to all your listeners as well.
All right, you too, Rand. Merry Christmas.